The B450 Gaming K4, is it a suitable, worthy AM4 motherboard? Well, yeah, but let's get into the nitty-gritty of why. Why? What is this motherboard? The ASRock Fatal1ty B450 Gaming K4, it's an updated board from last year. They updated the B350. And they didn't really change a whole bunch. This is sort of a 6+3 VRM configuration. You know, the chokes are not like a super high current. B450 is not supposed to be a super high current type board because, well, you're not going to be overclocking anyway. I mean, the thermal design power, the TDP of the 2700X, the flagship CPU, and the Ryzen refresh, 105 watts. And even with a modest overclock, even with the best overclock that you can get without liquid nitrogen, your CPU is not going to be using more than like 165 watts. And the power delivery system on this motherboard can handle around 200 watts, give or take, conservatively, before we start talking about like overheating and thermal throttling and that sort of thing. So for every AM4 CPU on the market, it's perfect in terms of power delivery. But let's be clear, who's this motherboard aimed at? This motherboard is aimed at enthusiasts who don't want to spend a bunch of money buying features that they don't really need or won't really use. The B450, I mean, the big difference between X470, X370, and B450 is that the X series CPUs support running SLI graphics, meaning that they can take the by 16 PCI Express lanes from the CPU and convert that into a by 8x8, so each GPU in the system has a direct connection to the CPU via PCI Express by 8. If I'm speaking some kind of crazy moon language, B450, you save money and get, what you don't get was stuff you weren't going to use anyway. I mean, I don't really know how else to explain it other than that. Maybe I should do a motherboard class that's like, here's the stuff that you look for in a motherboard, and then it's like, this is like, look for this when you're going to do this, and then look for this when you're going to do this. Because I always really enjoy it when people are like, I need an 800 watt power delivery system. And it's like, well, are you gonna have a 90 gallon tank of liquid nitrogen behind your house? Because if the answer to that's no, then no, I don't think you need an 800 watt power delivery system. Just say it. For the rear I/O, we've got two USB 2.0 ports, a combo PS2 mouse keyboard port, D-sub, that's VGA, DisplayPort, now that's rare. It's rare to see onboard DisplayPort, and HDMI. The DisplayPort does support 4K, FreeSync, the whole 9 yards. We've got HDMI. HDMI is 1.4, so it's not going to drive 4K, but there you go. Then we've got USB 3.1, Gen 2, 10 gigabit, one Type A, one Type C, and 4 USB 3.1 Gen 1, that's the 5 gigabit. We've also got a Realtek 8111 Ethernet, and then we've got our Elna audio. This is based on the Realtek ALC 892 codec. You just get the 3 outputs. A lot of other motherboards in this class have the 6 outputs, but it is what it is. For the VRM solution on this motherboard, it's 6+3, but the 6 are sort of weaker. I mean, the 6 can't really handle as much current as the 3, but running this with a 2700X for an extended period of time, the area got hot, but not, overheating or throttling or anything like that. So probably the weakest thing on this motherboard for casual, ordinary users is the sound solution. The sound solution is based on a Realtek ALC 892. That's the Elna, audio solution. It is a Sound Blaster 5 software package. So you're getting the Sound Blaster software, but Realtek ALC 892, I would have liked to see a Realtek 1220 based solution, but honestly, there's not that much of a difference. If sound is super important to you, get an add-in sound card because you've got PCI Express slots out the wazoo. Unique features on this is B450. It's got 2 M.2 slots, which is pretty rare for a B450 motherboard. One of those is PCI Express 3.0 directly into the CPU. The other one is PCI Express 2.0. That's half bandwidth through the chipset. But unless you're getting a really high-end M.2, maybe that's totally fine. It has 6 gigabit per second SATA ports. 2 of those share bandwidth with the primary CPU M.2. So if you use the CPU M.2, some of your SATA ports will be disabled. So if you're adding NVMe and SATA, just pay attention to which ones you plug it into. You can check the manual for reference, confirmation, whatever. It has both 5050 and digital Rgb strip LED headers. So depending on whichever kind of Rgb strip, if you're gonna do Rgb strips, it has the headers for that. It has dual USB 3.1 Gen 2, 10 gigabit at the back. So this is pretty, standard fare for B450. Honestly, the thing that's unique here is the board layout. So it has 4 PCI Express by 1 slots. Those go to the chipset. Those don't really share bandwidth with anything. And then you get your M.2 number 2 slot. Although, well, I guess that goes through the chipset, and all of that shares its connection to the CPU. So that's just because it's the chipset. And the connection from the chipset to the CPU, that's PCI Express 3.0. So the aggregate bandwidth from all those chipset devices can't be more than 4 gigabytes per second, but that's not really much to worry about. It's got some USB and some other stuff that goes through there. Not really a big deal. Then you've got the rest of the board layout for, what I mentioned, the primary slot, PCI Express by 16 for your graphics. It's always PCI Express by 16. It's never not PCI Express by 16, no matter how you've populated stuff in the system. So for normal people computers, like DIY computers, that's a perfectly normal board layout. It's a perfectly normal situation. So if you see this board on sale and you think, will it work for me? Will it work in my specific use case? Unless you're doing something exotic, then yeah, it's gonna work fine. You don't need any of the stuff that you're not getting on this motherboard versus, an X470, unless you're specifically buying for like SLI, dual graphics support, whatever. This motherboard will do it. So what's the Linux rundown on this motherboard? Well, it's a bit unique. The Linux support for the hardware is pretty good. I mean, it's a Realtek audio. You want to get the 3 audio I/O pins. It's a Realtek 8111 gigabit network adapter. That's pretty well supported. I'm testing with Ubuntu 18.04, so it's kernel 4.15. Basically, that works. This motherboard supports ECC. Yes, that's right. ECC, error correcting memory, confirmed working. I tested it with Kingston Crucial, which is based on Micron chips, and Samsung reference ECC memory. In all cases, ECC was detected and supported. I didn't have to enable anything in the UEFI. It just worked. I know that it's doing error corrections, and you've got some options around ECC in the AMD CBS configuration. So in the UEFI for the overclock mode, I would recommend not ASRock mode, but the AMD mode, just in case that's setting some funny status registers or something like that. You can actually configure the options around ECC in the AMD section of the UEFI in terms of like if you want the more modern error reporting or the old school error reporting, but it's detected and working correctly by the Linux kernel. So that's exciting on a B450 motherboard. Remember, AMD doesn't disable it. It's up to the board partners. Now, to be sure, this is not like qualified. This is not commercial grade hardware that we're dealing with here. But for a home server, it'll probably be fine. IOMMU groups, because the B450 doesn't support splitting the by 16 into a by 8 by 8 configuration, the IOMMU options are kind of limited, but this motherboard is unique. The PCI Express by 16 slot shares its bandwidth with the NVMe. So the NVMe is PCI Express 3.0 by 4 to the CPU. Unlike on the Intel platform, those lanes are dedicated directly to the AMD CPU. So the AMD CPU actually has 20 PCI Express 3.0 lanes available to the end user. 16 through the graphics card and 4 through the NVMe. This motherboard is unique in that it breaks out those NVMe lanes into an expansion slot. So you can pick if you want to use an M.2 NVMe and PCI Express by 4, or if you want to use those 4 PCI Express 3.0 lanes in that by 16 slot. This motherboard also provides a second M.2. That second M.2 is PCI Express by 4 2.0 through the chipset. So the chipset connection there. So unless you have a really fast M.2 that exceeds 2 gigabytes per second read or write, you would, well, if you had a slower M.2 that doesn't exceed 2 gigabytes per second read or write, you could use it in the second M.2 slot and be fine. But if you've got a newer M.2 or a fast M.2, you'll want to use the M.2 slot above the graphics card that is wired into the CPU. But for Linux, for a home server, you could run a GPU, you could run a PCI Express by 1 server, like server GPU that you get from eBay. That's a thing, those exist. You could run your GPU in the by 4 slot to put some really high speed, storage controller or something like that in the PCI Express by 16 slot, but you'll find most storage controllers are also PCI Express by 4, so this could be a pretty pretty nice little inexpensive setup for a home server, just because you've got the sort of the oddball PCI Express layout. I think this is this was a unique feature on the B350 motherboard. It's nice to see ASRock carry that over to the B450. So in terms of Linux support or using this as a Linux workstation, works pretty well. If you did want to do, VFIO graphics card pass-through, you could use the PCI Express by 4 for your add-in graphics card. It'll bottleneck a little bit running it PCI Express by 4 for your virtual machine, but because it is CPU lanes, it's in its own IO-MMU group. All of the other peripherals that go through the chipset, those are only in one IO-MMU group, so there's no isolation or anything special like that. So if you were hoping to use, all of the peripherals through the chipset in their own IO-MMU groups, that's still not a thing. I'm not expecting it until maybe Zen 2. So that's not going to be a thing on any B450 motherboard, because the B350 and the B450, the chipset, not really changed a lot. It's just lessons learned for the motherboards. But Linux support, A, on this motherboard. Okay, what's the skinny on memory support? The memory support on this motherboard, I had trouble. On the box, it says that it's rated for up to DDR4 3200. I've got error correcting memory in it right now at 2666. I had trouble getting, I've got other error correcting memory that'll run at 2933. Had trouble getting that running at 2933. I've also got this G-Skill Trident Z. This is DDR4 4000 that we've used on other boards and platforms. And I tried plugging in known good timings. I couldn't get anything to post over 3200 at all. Like, this memory has posted on M4 Ryzen systems up to 3733 just fine. And 3200 was not stable. 2933 was stable, so that's probably good news if you're gonna get like a Ryzen 5 plus Vega. So I was a little disappointed for the RAM support. Now that may just be down to the UEFI. I was using UEFI version 1.30, which released just before this video. So that RAM timing stuff may be something that I revisit. But compared to other B450 boards and even ASRock's own, X470 boards, the memory, like getting the memory to run really quickly, was surprisingly problematic on this board. Fortunately, recovering from that situation wasn't really a big deal. In terms of features, like what would I complain about on this motherboard? I would have liked to have seen a higher end audio solution, just slightly higher end. I mean, just not anything super crazy. I would have also liked to see a way to flash the BIOS from a USB stick just for future CPU compatibility. I really think on AM4, having the ability to upgrade your BIOS without a CPU is less headache for the end users. Now, if you do get in a situation in the future where you buy this board and it won't post, or you're having CPU issues because you bought a newer CPU than this board supports, like you bought, Ryzen 3 or Ryzen, because it's going to be supported until 2020. Yeah, AM4 is 2020. You can buy this board as an entry-level system and then upgrade later. That's totally a thing. You can totally do that. You don't have to replace everything. Just get a new CPU. So if you are in a situation where you've bought this board and a newer CPU and you're watching this video in the future, AMD will send you a loaner CPU, really old loaner CPU that you can use to flash the BIOS on this. But mailing it and mailing it back, it's still less headache than replacing the motherboard, don't get me wrong, but it would be nice if there was a way to upgrade the BIOS from USB. In terms of other differentiating factors for this motherboard, really honestly, it's probably StoreMI. Now, Level 1 did a separate video on StoreMI and all the cool stuff you can do with StoreMI. In a nutshell, what it does is it lets you combine storage. So I've got this 8TB WD Red hard drive and a 256GB ADATA NVMe. It's pretty snappy NVMe. It's not the most expensive NVMe, but it's not the least expensive NVMe. And this is a WD Red hard drive. Why red? Well, the Reds are perhaps a little bit more reliable, a little less likely to die a fiery death. What StoreMI does for you is it combines both of these storage devices in a tiered storage configuration in software. And so things that you use frequently will automatically run from the fast NVMe, and things that you don't use or run or that don't need the speed will run from the 8TB mechanical hard drive, which mechanical hard drives are slower than molasses running down the side of a jar in January. So StoreMI will let you have things that run as fast as an NVMe, but you can have as much space as a mechanical hard drive. StoreMI was Originally launched with the X470 boards. It's also available on B450. So it's a pretty cool software feature. You should check it out. So there you have it. That's the verdict on this board. I really like the PCI Express layout. I mean, that's clever. It's very clever of ASRock to do that. I would have liked to see some slightly higher end features on the B450 motherboard, but hey, it's an everyman motherboard. And at this price point, it is super competitive. So, you know, making the choice between capacitors that are like 2 cents more expensive is a huge differentiating factor for boards around this price point. All in all, it will get you where you want to go. I mean, if you want to run Ryzen 2700X with overclocks, this board will totally do it. You can overclock to your heart's content with this board and not have any issues, even if you choose the 8-core Ryzen 7 2700X. I think this board is better paired with like the 2600X or the 2600. Those are 6-core. That's gonna go more with the type of system that you would build based around this board, but hey, that's just my opinion. If you decide to build a system with this and you want to show it off, post pictures in the Level 1 Techs forums. I'm Wendell, and I'm going to hang out in the Level 1 Techs forums and look at pictures of other people's computers from the last time I asked for this. So if you bought this board and you're having trouble with something, or you're trying to use it on Linux, or whatever, come to the forums. We'll try to help you.